Around about page 246, Nattiez begins the second main section of his article from 1990. And he says, yeah, back in 1972, I actually conducted a field experiment, and it went like this. I asked 300 school children back in Montreal to listen twice to Paul Ducas's symphonic poem, Sorcerer's Apprentice. After they'd heard the piece twice, they were then given 15 to 20 minutes in which to convey their impression of the story told by the music. Nattiez then goes on to categorise their responses, and he says, well, 47 of them really didn't seem to get the point, but 253 responses tried to read the piece or to explain the piece as they heard it as a story. But he says in doing this, they seem to be projecting a narrative onto a listening experience. And so he gives a list of genre types on page 247. He then goes on to cross-examine these genre types according to an event sequence that represents a species of intuitive formal analysis as he sees it. Here then is the first question in the second video, so this is now question 6. Nattiez goes on to conclude that the overall impression one should take away from the evidence he's put together is that of listeners attempting to codify their listening awareness according to kinetic or dynamic associations. In other words, they think of music as something dynamic in a sense of physical movement, almost like an implied ballet. But in doing this, does he think that the thematic elements, if you like the leitmotifs, that are there in Ducas's composition were strongly identified? So the question, the nub of the question, the point of the question is, were the thematic elements strongly identified in relation to this kinetic or dynamic account that the children gave? So moving forwards, Nattiez says, one possible narrative interpretation which takes these factors into account, so he's allowing the case for this to be a narrative phenomenon even so, is that of something called the plot archetype, proposed by an American musicologist. This is Anthony Newcomb. And what Newcomb means by this is a tracing of the trajectory formed by the series of emotional or affective states that music conveys. So this is what plot archetype means. And here now is question 7. Nattiez concedes that plot archetype may indeed be an appropriate concept. However, does he see it as intrinsic to the substance of music? Does he see that plot archetype is something intrinsic to music? Is it actually immanent? Is it actually there in the notes themselves? Is that what he believes? Rather than discuss narrative interpretation categorically, Nattiez accepts that it represents a historically valid tendency. So rather than dismiss narrative interpretation categorically, Nattiez accepts that it represents a historically valid tendency, and one that amounts to a geographically and culturally specific template or schema of behaviour through which ideological disposition is symbolically mediated. So that's quite a complex set of ideas. Let's just run through it again. So even though he's becoming quite sort of skeptical in his overall opinion, rather than dismiss narrative interpretation as something flatly wrong, Nattiez accepts that historically it perhaps grew up or began to develop for historically valid reasons, both geographically and culturally. It may be a kind of specific template that we have brought to bear on music, or he says a schema of behaviour through which ideological disposition, in other words, a set of guiding beliefs, is given a kind of symbolic form. In other words, it's represented through musical substance. And we might think, I have no idea what that means, but then think what Peter Franklin was claiming. He said that the boy on the train using his Star Wars merchandise was actually then acting out the drama using the themes by John Williams to be able to sort of articulate his own sense of what Star Wars really was. In other words, he was kind of in his own head thinking of a cinematic representation. And this is what I think Nattiez means. And Peter Franklin argues a strong case for this. He says, so used are we in the 20th century, and already so disposed were we in the 19th century through the symphony, that this kind of, what shall we say, this kind of cultural template formation or behavioural schema is all we really know, and how could we know much else? It's been so deeply embedded in our thinking about the way that we relate to the world, and thus we relate to music in this way also. So question 8. What term does Nattiez introduce to categorise the way that music mimics the syllabic patterning of language? So question 8. What term does Nattiez introduce to characterise the way that music mimics the syllabic patterning of language? Nattiez relates this thought to Caroline Abate's description of the sound of the voice narrating, and notes some parallels between music and language in this regard, embodied in the work of both Czech and English composers. He actually mentions Edward Elgar. He also reinforces his interpretation, his proposition, with reference to a couple of composers. One is a living Canadian composer, Denis Bouillon, as well as to 19th century composer strongly influenced by literary thinking, and that's Robert Schumann. Two last questions then, and then a closing comment. Question 9. Which 19th century novelist does Nattiez acknowledge as being influential on Schumann? And a couple of pieces here. He references the piano cycle Carnival, opus 9, and then the finale of the string quartet, opus 41, number 3. So he partly links these ideas to the work of Anthony Newcomb, but he said, okay, definitely in the case of Carnival and the string quartet, there are some literary influences that Schumann was prepared to himself promote. But which 19th century novelist is he particularly reliant on? Is he particularly influenced by? Now then, the final question, question 10. Which German word that Nattiez introduces exemplifies the principle of interconnection underlying an apparently incoherent artistic surface? So the idea of an artistic surface which seems to be very haphazard, very uncontrolled, but underneath it there is a principle of interconnection, but there's a specific word that's associated with the novelist that Schumann was especially influenced by. What is that word? It's a short word. So here's the closing comment. In spite of his reservations, so we're summing up now, Nattiez does recognise that one aspect of postmodern artistic expression is indeed congruent with narrative organisation. So he says, in our own time, it's interesting to see how music changed around about, well, late 1970s, certainly early 1980s. And he says, for instance, composers like Luciano Berio and Pierre Boulez seemed now to embrace linearity in their music. In other words, connection, no longer concerned to compose a series of fragments, disconnected all the way along, but to impose a linear sense, which is a continuous strand through which the composers can actually convey their ideas, and that, in the end, audiences find more approachable and more assimilable. Okay, so those are the 10 questions. Let me have your responses if you can by, I think it's Monday I'll ask for them, around about 12 noon, and then I'll move on to the next article. I'll submit that once I have your answers in, okay? So yeah, thanks very much in anticipation. I'll look forward to seeing the responses. Don't think they're too hard. Again, very short answers will do fine. Just pick up the information and show that you've got a clear grasp of the way the overall article proceeds. All right, thanks again. See you soon.